Hi everyone, it's Shane Tedford, and this is my presentation on competence to plead guilty. In the last chapter, we focused on adjudicative competence, which refers to a defendant's ability to understand and participate in the legal process like standing trial. Now, we're shifting our focus to decisional competence. This is a more specific concept as it refers to a defendant's ability to make informed, rational choices about particular legal decisions, such as whether to plead guilty, waive trial, or testify. While adjudicative competence is about general fitness for trial, decisional competence looks at a person's ability to understand the consequences of specific decisions and make them voluntarily. Traditionally, the state has been granted broad authority to make decisions for individuals who are unable to make decisions for themselves. This legal concept is known as parens patriae, which translates to state as parent. However, in much of Western society, we place a high value on individual autonomy, the idea that human dignity requires allowing people to make their own choices unless there are strong reasons not to. This leads to an important limitation. The state should only invoke its parens patriae power when a person lacks the capacity to make a specific decision regarding a specific act. This is why decisional competence becomes such a critical, yet often overlooked issue in forensic and legal contexts. It's not enough to be generally impaired. What matters is the ability to make a decision at a specific time. I will be talking about the decisional competence involved in the competence to plead guilty. It is important to know that over 90% of criminal cases are resolved through a guilty plea instead of going to trial. Because of this, ensuring the defendant's competence at this stage is critical. A guilty plea must be knowing, meaning the defendant fully understands what they are doing when they plead guilty. Intelligent, indicating they comprehend the consequences. Involuntary, which means the plea is made without pressure or coercion. Decisional competence here protects the legal rights of defendants and helps guarantee that their pleas are fair and valid. According to the Supreme Court, for a defendant's plea to be considered a knowing plea, they must understand at least three aspects of the criminal process. First, they need to understand the nature of the charge they are pleading to, basically what they are being accused of. Second, they must know the penalties that are associated with that charge, such as potential fines or jail time. And third, they must be aware of the rights they are giving up by pleading guilty. Some of these rights may include the right to remain silent, the right to confront their accusers, the right to a jury trial, and the right to have a lawyer represent them at trial. It is not enough to just plead guilty. A judge must confirm on the record during a plea hearing that the defendant fully understands all of the implications associated with pleading guilty. Until the early 1990s, courts debated whether pleading guilty required a higher level of competence than going to trial. The Ninth Circuit in Sealing versus Eamon argued that it did because a defendant who pleads guilty must not only understand the charges and consequences, but also knowingly waive several constitutional rights. However, in Godez versus Morgan, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected that view. The court ruled that the standard for competence is the same whether a defendant pleads guilty or goes to trial. Their reasoning was that even someone going to trial must make important decisions such as whether to remain silent, testify, or waive a jury. So, according to the court, no higher level of mental competence is needed to plead guilty. This ruling aligned with the majority of federal courts and effectively unified the standard nationwide. The instrument that was developed to help determine whether a defendant has the understanding of the rights they waive when they enter a plea of guilty or no contest is called the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool Criminal Application. This tool doesn't just assess legal competence, it goes further, examining whether the defendant's decision is both knowing and voluntary. Knowing goes beyond assessing competence to proceed. Rather, it is a matter of decisional competence that requires an inquiry into whether the waiver of right associated with a guilty plea reflects autonomous decision-making. The examiner should consider the defendant's reason for their decision to plead guilty. For example, I'm pleading guilty because aliens told me to, suggests a defendant whose autonomy is seriously impaired. The examiner must also consider the voluntary component of the inquiry during their evaluation. The voluntary aspect looks at whether the plea is made freely without coercion. Since guilty pleas often come with reduced consequences, it is important to assess whether the plea stems from a fair deal or if the defendant felt pressured by the prosecution. Overall, the MACCATCA helps the examiner ensure that a defendant's plea is truly informed and voluntary, protecting their legal rights in the process. In evaluating whether a defendant's plea is truly knowing and voluntary, it is crucial that the examiner provides a clear description of the defendant's reasoning process. This includes how the defendant arrived at the decision to plead guilty and whether they may have been influenced by internal or external pressures such as fear, coercion, or misunderstanding. It is important to note that the judge makes the final decision on competence, while the examiner offers insight into the defendant's mental state as it relates to their plea. In conclusion, competence to plead guilty requires that a defendant not only understand the nature of the charges and the consequences of a guilty plea, but also that they make the decision knowingly, voluntarily, and intelligently. Forensic psychologists play a crucial role in this process by conducting thorough evaluations to assess the defendant's mental state, cognitive abilities, and understanding of legal proceedings. Their expert assessments help courts determine whether a defendant is truly competent to waive their rights and to enter a guilty plea. I have included a link to a video in the discussion part of my video from Cruz Law regarding pleading guilty. I think this is a good video for the presentation because it is important to understand what it means to plead guilty and the process behind pleading guilty. I think this is important to know before taking a deep dive into learning about something more complicated like competence to plead guilty. My discussion question for you all is, should there be a higher standard of competence required to plead guilty than to stand trial? Why or why not? And how should forensic psychologists approach this issue in their evaluation? And then on my last slide here, I have just included my references. Thank you.